It's a pleasure to be here, and thus far I've very much enjoyed the conversation that I've had with a few of you and look forward to continued conversations. So there's several moving parts to my discussion, my observations here, focusing on the intersection of social movements. It's relevant to concerns about the sustainability, particularly sustainable consumption, and the mechanisms of kind of interpretive mechanisms of framing and identity work. So I have a couple orienting propositions here. First, which I'm sure everybody understands, that hasn't always been the case historically, but that social movements are important agents of challenge and change. But of course they're context dependent, and you can have movements with similar interests in the same place and how they're going to operate and so forth. Depends on various factors that social movement scholars look at that impinges on their character and operation. You know, it's hard to look historically and also contemporarily at events in the world without noting the significance of social movements as agents of change. Certainly, there's not a great religion in the world that did not originate as a social movement, and certainly the changes within these religions were based on social movements. And where we are today in this country and in much of the world, it would be hard-pressed to understand had it not been for under the broad umbrella of rights movements, you know, beginning certainly back with Gandhi, extending through King into South Africa. But the umbrella is much larger than that, so you have all kinds of human rights movements under that. So movements are clearly one important agent of change. Another orienting proposition is that interaction, I think we forget this at times, between humans or humans and other objects. It doesn't matter what the object is, minimally requires that the other or object be situated in time and space. And that entails the announcement or attribution of an identity, what it is. And this underscores the importance of something I will be discussing, identity work. And the third orienting proposition is that meanings, including identities, do not naturally or automatically attach themselves to the objects, events, or experiences we encounter, but arise instead through interpretive processes. And that underscores the importance of framing. Let me start with a few observations about the social movement so you at least know what I'm talking about. As with most concepts in the social sciences, you know, it's not like there's unanimity around word-for-word conceptualizations. But in general, if you look at most attempts to conceptualize social movements, you find these 5 elements. That they're challengers to or defenders of existing structures of authority. And I say, be they institutional or culture, one of the things I've emphasized with a few other people is that oftentimes when people, certainly in this country, and Europe too, have talked about social movements, they talk about them as political challenges to the state. And that's certainly one cluster of social movements, but they're much broader than that. And virtually every institution, medical, educational, religious, occasionally will have social movements within them. Sometimes they're touch or branch out to the state, and as well as culture and challenges to various elements of culture. So I kind of take a broader conceptualization. Obviously, they're collective rather than individual enterprises. often we think, oh, it's people clustering and moving in the streets, occupying public spaces, that sort of thing. And that's true in part, but so they act with varying degrees of, or exist outside of institutional and normative arrangement. So oftentimes social movements will be involved with lobbying, governments, or within institutions, but also will engage in tactics outside of institutional and normative arrangements because of the lack of sufficient access to begin to either secure a voice and begin to hope to affect some change. Fourth point, pretty clear that there's some degree of organization. They're not just random, sporadic, disorganized enterprises. And of course, there's typically some degree of temporal continuity. I think it's helpful to distinguish between when we think of action to change, or that we have some grievances, can occur in different ways. So on the left there, the level of action, individual or collective, and then whether the challenge is direct or indirect. So in the first cell, or type 1, we're all familiar with these kind of individual level grievances. We all have them and express them from time to time, but in classic examples are appeals to authority, to one's boss, to one's leader for some kind of personal adjustment. I don't know if it wasn't a very good movie a number of years ago, but there was this movie called Falling Down with Michael Douglas. And, things were just piling up on him. It was what you would call a very bad day. And it was in LA, and there was a traffic jam. He needed to get someplace, and he was laying on the horn, and one thing led to another. And he all had a host of grievances, all of which many people could identify with. But it stays at the individual level. It's not something that people begin to organize around and becomes a collective. Another type of individual action, but indirect, everyday forms of resistance and withdrawal. The political scientist James Scott at Yale wrote a well-received book, influential book, a number of years ago called Weapons of the Weak, based primarily on his research on peasant communities. But here again, there's individual grievance, malcontent, and you find other ways maybe, but individually, to disrupt to a certain extent systems of operation. When we move down to type 3, you get into the collective action, the social movements. And this is where most of the movements with which we're familiar, and this would be where movements having environmental movements concerned with sustainability issues would be clustered. But some would find some also in type 4. And this is a cluster of collective activity that has not received sufficient attention by social movement scholars. Many of you are probably familiar with a famous book by Albert Hirschman, Exit, Voice, and Loyalty. But interestingly, the social movement scholars became fixated on voice and kind of forgot exit. But I've argued that exit, in many respects, is even a larger challenge because you're choosing to leave a system and rejecting it. And, so we have movements like that, separatist movements. All of that's playing out in connection with terrorist movements, too, in Ukraine today. But there are also communal movements, and these overlap sometime with environmental movements and movements that have interest in sustainability. Certainly in the late 60s and 70s, when you had a good number of communal movements, certainly in Northern California. They didn't call it sustainability then, but one of the key issues was organizing a particular style of life that had some kind of congruence with the environment and could give rise to a sustainable lifestyle. So movements of interest you in type 4 as well as type 3. A couple other observations with respect to movements. Most questions that are asked would fall under these four. What are the conditions underlying and facilitating the emergence of mobilization? Who participates, why some people rather than others? Internal, external dynamics, you get into strategies, tactics, goals, and then the consequences. What difference does it make, and difference for whom? And it's not just targets, but constituents, various levels of constituents, but also adversaries. So there are different ways to assess. My comments when you get into framing and identity really focus on these first two sets of questions. If you have other questions when we open it up for questions about social movements in general and the kind of contextual conditions, facilitating conditions, we can talk about that. Certainly when we talk about mobilizing grievances, issues of identity, framing come into play. Political opportunity cuts across the study of sociology and political science. Resource mobilization cuts across those as well as studies in schools of business. And then ecological factors that also can affect the character of social movements. Okay, let me turn to the one other topic here, and thinking about whatever your interest, what are some of the pressure points or modes of orientation. A good number of years ago, a one-time famous Harvard sociologist who's been forgotten in some degrees today, by the name of Talcott Parsons, and a University of Chicago sociologist by the name of Edward Shills, wrote this book on developing a theory of action. And one of the things early on that I found always interesting is that what they call types of object orientation. That whatever the object, whatever we want to do, there are basically three kinds of orientation to it. The first one, the instrumental material, it's really kind of the realm of the economist to a certain extent, but you're talking about the use value and exchange value of what the object is, whether it be persons, livestock, or other kind of object. The affective cathectic is in terms of orientation, feelings, and emotion. And then the moral normative or values oriented in terms of prescriptive or prescriptive guidelines. And then there's the fourth one I would add, identity. And it is arguable, I think, that maybe that's kind of the master orientation in as much as identities can kind of be the overlap, the congruence of all three of these. So let me turn to, but I mean the other thing that's important, if you're going to affect change, certainly at the individual level, but it's not just individuals at the ground, it's also individuals head of NGOs, INGOs, governments, and so on. How are you orienting yourself, and what are the various kind of appeals that you might be able to make? And sometimes we get locked into the instrumental material when these others can be very effective as well. So let me move to identity. And here very broadly, I'm just using it as a cover term for the names that we impute or vow in the course of acting and interacting with the objects of our orientation, whether they be animate or inanimate. Another way to think of identity, there's the pegs on which our self is hung. Others know us through our projected identities and our claimed identities. Of course, when we talk about projected, there are different theoretical perspectives, kind of the essentialist perspectives of primordial identities, race, gender, that sort of thing, or the structural basis of social class, social roles, and so on. A third point related to the issue of consumption is that I think our identity and consumption are very, very strongly interconnected. And interconnected in both a cause and effect way, because what we consume is a key marker of our identity, sometimes wittingly, sometimes unwittingly. And identity is also a key driver of our consumptive behavior. So if you're interested in modifying behavior with respect to consumptive practices, certainly one place to play a little bit in terms of trying to affect some change is with respect to identity. And here I want to talk a bit about the notion of identity work, because this, again, is both witting and unwitting. I mean, oftentimes we're keenly aware of it, sometimes we're not so keenly aware of it. But here we're talking about identity work, the range of activities that individuals and groups engage in that give meaning to themselves and to others, and by presenting or attributing and sustaining particular identities with their, that are congruent with their interest. So how do we do that? There are several types of identity work. And we're all familiar with all of them because we engage in them in different ways. The arrangement and display of physical settings and props. Of course, that could be one's housing, one's apartment. It could be driving a high-end car. It doesn't really matter. The quality of the car or the maker, it all says something or can say something. People can read into that something about who we are or what we're trying to say about ourselves. Another way in which we engage in identity work is through arrangement of appearance. I mean, cosmetic face work, the clothes we wear, tattoos, all sorts of things that in some way or the other, we use out of our own domiciles to say something about who we are and in what way we're representing the enterprises and organizations we belong to. We also communicate about identity, and we read about other people's identities from a selective association with individuals and groups. I suppose one of the things all of our mothers said to us at some point in time is, be careful who you hang with. And for good reason, because people read into to that and start attributing certain things to you. And a fourth mode of identity work is identity talk, and we're doing all that all the time, wittingly and unwittingly. But here we're vowing and attributing identities directly as when we say I am, that is, they are, and so on, or indirectly when we're talking about the products we consume. It would be interesting to know, and I don't know if there's been such a study, but what proportion of talk is talk about consumption? Of course, when I'm with and it depends in part what you do. My sister, who's here, is a chef. And of course, when we get together, we talk, probably 70% of what we discuss is about food and wine. But these are all products. Monday night, we were at a Seder. What did we talk about most of the time? Well, food, and of course its symbolic significance. But it just doesn't have to be food. The line of work one's in, if one's in fashion, if one's in something selling cars or whatever, it's about products that we're trying to sell or distribute and the consumption of them. So it's kind of interesting when we think about consumption, how much time is spent not only displaying but talking about it, and how fundamental that is to our identity. And so that suggests to me one kind of pressure point, if you want to call it that, where if you're trying to affect certain kind of changes and get people to think along your tracks, one place to work is with in terms of the kinds of things that their identities are built on and how that might be modified in some way. And this takes us to framing, is a key mechanism, I think, for affecting or reconstructing identity. Now, the word frame is in our everyday lexicon. You see it in the newspapers, you see it with newscasters and so on. And it's used widely in social science and communication research. What I've tried to do is that most people don't go beyond just using something as framed in such a way to how you might be able to analyze it fairly systematically, and so I've tried to develop a conceptual scheme that's at least relevant to the study of social movements. I mean, we know that frames are material linguistic discursive advices that render or help to render things understandable. They answer certain kind of questions and thus help organize experience and action. But, you know, and this goes back to saying everything's is subject to some construction. So let's see here. These two slides here. Just look a minute and what do you see and what's going on? Now, from an environmental standpoint, an issue in sustainability, one thing you could say, oh yeah, these penguins clustered someplace in the Antarctica. But you know, if climate change is what the preponderance of scientists say it is, and the seas continue to warm ever so slightly, our friends here are not going to be, maybe not be around much longer, or at least their population is going to be reduced considerably. Well, that's one argument. And I imagine, if you didn't see it, you were all familiar with the documentary, The March of the Penguins, back in, I think, around 2005. But these folks are subject to quite different interpretations that probably most of you would make. At a conference for young Republicans, the editor of the National Review urged participants to see the movie because it promoted monogamy. And a widely circulated Christian magazine said it made a strong case for intelligent design. Now, interestingly, this is at the same time this, at Dover, Pennsylvania, the evolution creation scientist case was going on. Or this Michael Medved, a very conservative critic and radio host, says, if it is a motion picture this summer that most passionately affirms traditional norms like monogamy, sacrifice, and child rearing. I mean, this kind of illustrates the importance of framing in terms of how you see things. And here, these folks, in so many words, trying to instruct, to tell conservative Christian followers what's going on here. My guess is probably not an interpretation that if you saw the March of the Penguins, it came readily to your minds. So what do frames help us do? I mean, I think you see here, like any picture frame, they focus attention. They tell us what's in frame, what's out of frame. They articulate the punctuated elements of the scene, so that one meaning rather than another is conveyed. And they may also have a transformative function in that some of the objects of attention are seen or understood as relating to each other in ways that you might not have imagined. And in the study of social movements and conflict in general, we see this in all kinds of ways. Of course, you know, the dehumanization of combatants and adversaries, not only in war, but in the case of mass killings and genocide. That the other is something quite different, but it's something that just doesn't occur naturally. Leaders often work very hard at that. Of course, whether it's religious or political conversion, political education, whatever, reinterpretation of one's biography. And of course, the song Amazing Grace, that's what that's all about, isn't it? How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I was once lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. That's a transformative way of looking at one's biography in light of certain events. And of course, for students of social movements, what often happens is the transformation of misfortunes, of the very kind of grievances that was occurring in the movie I mentioned earlier, into complaints, into injustices in mobilizing. There's a difference between something that's kind of a misfortune and now you call it an injustice. And the lines of action associated with misfortune versus an injustice can be quite different. I'm not going to go over all of these, but in developing a conceptual architecture of framing, these are kind of the ones I will talk about here briefly are these. And here we're talking about collective action frames. And the key thing here is that they call forth and legitimate social movement campaigns and activities. And they function in various ways to mobilize adherents. That's what some people call action mobilization. That's kind of like moving people from the balcony to the barricades, so to speak. They also can help convert bystanders into adherents. That we call consensus mobilization. And they can also function, importantly, as counter-mobilizing agents to neutralize the demobilized antagonist. And these kind of realizations have become important to students of movements. Let me go on here. These three framing tasks. Diagnostic framing, the diagnosis of, I call it problematization, but involves the diagnosis of some event, some aspect of life is troublesome and in need of repair, but it's not sufficient. There also has to be an attribution component to it if it's going to invite any kind of action in terms of blame and responsibility. Prognostic is the articulation of some kind of solution to the problem, some line of action in order to remedy the problem. And motivational framing addresses the free rider problem by articulating a call to arms, a rationale for engaging. It kind of gets at issues of responsibility and how do you move people in that fashion. Some examples, let's see, kind of a pro-sustainability diagnostic framing, and you can find all kinds of examples, but the argument of the decreasing gap between demand for resources and resource availability, the growing disjunction between human consumptive patterns, particularly in the first world, and the environment's carrying capacity, and then the conflicts associated with first world, third world, south, north, and that sort of thing. But to do something about that, you have to have an attribution of blame and responsibility. And for folks like this author, overpopulation. Then there can be secondary things, iatrogenic effect of modern medicine, kind of killing by curing. Similarly, with respect to innovations in agriculture and agronomy, failure to provide contraception to women, there can be any number of factors there. But you also have examples of anti-sustainability diagnostic framing. You go to climate change. It's not climate change or global warming. It's a fraud. The problem is liberals and big government. So I suppose you're all familiar in varying degrees with Rick Santorum and Glenn Beck. And Rick Santorum's not the only one to hold this view, but there's no such thing as junk science. And my congressman, due to the shifting boundaries of congressional lines in California, his fellow Dana Rohrabacher, global warming's a total fraud. The attribution of blame was a hoax. It's a hoax. It's just an excuse for more government control over your life. Or as Rohrbacher says, it's being designed because what you've got liberals is step-by-step, bigger control over the lives. So it's a totally different framing, a totally different attribution of blame in terms of the. So there's a dispute, if you want, a frame dispute, a frame debate, a conflict, there's heightened contestation going on. And I have another slide I'll show in a little bit, but I think you probably know that people fall out in different spots in this, and you'd be hard-pressed to say that the preponderance of the country believe that it's a serious problem. Some may recognize global warming as a problem, but what they think of are polar bears and a few islands here and there, but do not think about it generally in terms of impacting their lives. Let me just turn here to core framing task. Here, this is again back to the prognostic framing, but and you can fill these in, but certainly one with respect to global warming is limiting carbon emissions, and there's the still debated cap and trade and these sorts of things. Anti-sustainability is no, you don't worry about these things. It would disrupt the economy, and so you neutralize. This is the counterframing, the advocates. Motivational framing, this gets at moving people. People can agree with you. They can share your point of view, but it doesn't guarantee by any means that they're going to join you. So it's the problem, metaphorically, of getting people from the balcony to the barricades. And this is where, and the classic Mansur-Olson's free rider problem, an issue of selective incentives. And this is what we call motivational framing that provide vocabulary. So, and it usually kind of breaks down in terms of 5 possibilities, the severity of the problem or the challenge. So, I mean, it's kind of talking about the immensity of change that's going to come unless something is done. I mean, I live in Newport Beach, California. I don't live on the water, but some of you may be familiar with that area. This island called Balboa Island. Very nice homes on it. You can walk around. Sometimes the water, the high tide does splash over onto the sidewalk. But if sea levels rise, pretty slightly, that real estate may not be worth much. Now, of course, we're figuring out how to do something. We're talking to the Dutch and figure out how to preserve, because there's a lot of money there. But thus far, it's not there's not enough gravitas to that threat that it is moving people. Going along with that is the urgency of acting now. A key factor in any kind of collective action social movement is some sense of efficacy, that if people are going to get together, if they're going to work together, that it'll make a difference. I mean, all of you wouldn't be sitting here and wouldn't come to your meetings if you didn't think that this institute would not make some difference. There's a sense of possible efficacy that can hold people together on working on a problem, but how do you convey that? And that can help motivate people. Then this thing of moral propriety, moral obligation, to save the world for future generations. So when you look at, as you all know, different conceptions of sustainability and sustainable consumption, it always seems there's two parts to find a way to sustain reasonable lifestyles in the here and now, but without sacrificing the lifestyles of our children and generations to come. And that can have some moral attractiveness to it. And then finally, the status enhancement, whether it's the notion of the elect, of a vanguard of history or whatever. You know, for some movements, this carries a lot of weight. For jihadist movements, this is a key factor with, you know, recruiting suicide bombers. You know, there's a world that not only weights them, that is better than the one they have, regardless of how many virgins there may be up there. But it also, a better world that awaits their family, because it's a ticket for whomever is connected to them, they get a pass. And maybe for some folks, that's an appeal. But there's always this this notion. You know, the theme song of the musical Les Mis is, you know, come and join this great cause, the moment to change the world. But again, these are different appeal points in terms of moving folks. A key aspect of framing is, I think you read this essay, but this notion of frame alignment, and that is of how it is that individuals' interest and objective become linked with a movement. And a couple of these I want to focus on. The bridging is really a network sort of issue, where you can have folks with kind of shared understandings of things, but structurally they're not connected, and finding ways to bridge them. Amplification is applicable to identity, it's applicable to values, and I like to think of, well, for our identities, we all have a host of identities that are arrayed in what you can call an identity hierarchy. And, you know, different roles, different contexts will bring to them to the forefront. So in this kind of situation, one identity is more salient than another. The same thing with values. There are studies that show that, you know, whether people are Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, or whatever, if you give them a list of values, you're going to find agreement on most of those values. That's not the right question. And so you get these folks that say, well, the values of people in red and blue states are not really that different. Well, I think you're asking the wrong questions. It's not about the values, it's about how they're arrayed in some kind of hierarchy. And that's key for, so this is the key, this notion of frame amplification, of zeroing in on certain values, certain identities, and trying to increase them in terms of their relative salience vis-a-vis other values or identities. Another way that can sometimes work is through extending the frame. So it goes beyond the initial interest, it goes beyond the initial community to other communities that that you want to convince them there's some kind of connection. So, I mean, you know, linking household consumption patterns with global environmental degradation, and trying to make that connection, and then some kind of moral responsibility. And then there's the transformation, but it can be in two ways. You're changing understanding's perspective. It can be specific or it can be global. And that's an interesting one to, how helpful is it to most people if you want to move them, if you're talking about some kind of global, very systemic sort of problem, versus trying to get to them at a really domain-specific level. That is, where they live, where they are, and in terms of what they do. A key factor, I'm just going to glide over this, but the issue of frame resonance, and the issue is, why do some frames take and others don't? Some fall on deaf ears, and what kind of factors, and we have two sets of factors here, the credibility of the frame and salience, and these are discussed, I believe, in that one of the articles you looked at. But in terms of thinking of identity and framing, I wanted to just talk about some impediments that affect how we do this sort of thing. All of these you're familiar with. Public perception and understandings of issues like climate change and evolution. The low regard for science. I read something where only about 42% of US adults have much confidence in science. But what goes along with that is, I think we live in an age, and have for a while, where there's a valorization of opinion. And of course, the technological advances in media, and that we could all be bloggers if we want, and so forth. There are stages now, there are spaces now that didn't used to exist, where we can all promote our ideas. And so you kind of have a cacophony of expert opinions out there on all kinds of topics. And then the propagation of what some people would call ignorance. I don't know if you've heard of this neologism, agnotology. The professor of the history of science, by the name of Proctor, Stanford, who's been working on this. But what it has to do with is the cultural production of ignorance. And this is important in relation to all of this, too, because you have industries like the big tobacco companies, media figures, media outlets that are engaged in part in misinformation and the propagation of what some folks would call ignorance. Another thing that makes it difficult, I think, we can talk about global warming, environmental problems, issues of sustainability, particular for divergent lifestyles and so forth, but it's often difficult for people to grasp these large evolving trends unless they have direct encounter with them. One thing I've written about that sometimes will attend to this and also will affect the importance of whether of diagnostic or prognostic framing is what I call quotidian disruption. And I think of the quote, we're talking about routinized everyday life. It's routinized not only in terms of practice, but it's also routinized psychologically. And certainly, I was talking to Maury, I guess you were talking about disasters. And disasters have that way of, kind of cracking in. The taken for granted is no longer taken for granted. And in the case of quotidian disruption, diagnostic framing is not so important because it's so palpable. Prognostic framing is still important. What do you do about it? But these trends that are evident to folks like you who are working in this enterprise and to some other folks, they're not always so evident, and that's part of the challenge. Then in the blind faiths and market system and the rational decision making, and one of the reasons it goes back to habit that doesn't always work so neatly is because things become habituated, taken for granted. These are just early phenomenal knowledge is Shute, an American pragmatist and philosopher, Mead, and English sociologist, theoretician Giddens. They all have terms for this sort of thing that focus attention on the force of habit. And then much of our lives are lived in that, and so we're not really thinking in kind of the rational calculus sort of way. It's when we're kind of knocked out of that habitual, taken for granted mode of thinking that maybe we're most vulnerable to listening to arguments about what's going on that's affecting our lives. And then there are these things called framing hazards, which undermine the prospect. First, I mentioned something earlier about public opinion, and I saw this 2012, maybe you're familiar with it, on climate change, and they just had these kind of categories. So you got about 16% of this representative sample who are alarmed. They see it's an urgent problem, but they don't know how to fix it, which is a prognostic framing problem. Then you've got the concerned, and these are the folks that are concerned about the polar bears and little islands, but they don't see it as really having much impact with respect to themselves. Cautious, haven't made up their minds whether it's real or man-made. The disengaged, never heard of it. The doubtful, the 12%, not man-made but natural, and poses no long-term threat. And then those folks, like my congressman and Rick Santorum, who see it as a hoax and it's a conspiracy created by scientists, maybe some of you folks, the data's cooked and so on. And you say, well, that's only 15%, but one thing we know about social movements, we're not talking about the majority. It's not like you have to have 75%, 50%, 40% of a country or of a people to get involved. It's often a small, but they're the loud ones. They're the ones that collectivize. They're the ones with a shared collective identity. And they can make a huge difference. And those are the folks, for many of these interests, you have to counteract. Framing hazards are just the threats that undermine the prospect of frame resonance, and framing errors or misframing. Frame disputes we've kind of talked about, the disagreement in terms of the appropriate right, diagnostic, prognostic, and then frame shifts, displacement from one to another. Just some work I've done, you take this issue of obesity, and it's one of the questions, why can't we make much headway in it? Well, sometimes the field of discourse or debate or contestation in which something is discussed is so crowded with alternative framings. There might be one for, and so you can never get the kind of collective congruence that you need to move people forward. So in terms of the obesity field, a few of these, the illness frame, problems, lifestyle, eating habits, the attribution as individuals and victims who can't control their own eating propensities, and if you're going to do anything, you got to change individual behavior. So who might they see or what might they do? Well, you've got pills or psychotherapy. The disease frame, no, it's the body chemistry, it's genetics. You know, what can we do? Intestinal bypass. There's no individual responsibility. Now there's a fat acceptance movement. The stigmatization, the problem is not fatness, it's the stigmatization of fatness. The medicine, media, film industry, and so forth, that's where the problem is. And so what we have to do is be more tolerant and have diversity training and so on. And then the fast food frame. Too many fat food choices, the fast food industry, advertising, and what we need are more healthy choices. But there are all of these, and there are even more. And you could probably fill out your own with respect to issues of sustainability and, you know, kind of generating a field of discourse in which you have these kind of contesting frames, each with different diagnoses and attributions and prognoses, and that makes the task, your task, much more complicated. Final thing I want to mention, and this is probably somewhat dated because I think it comes from 1999 data, from article by Browner and Leon, a book, well, you probably know it, The Consumer's Guide to Effective Environmental Choice. Practical advice from the Union of Concerned Scientists. But anyway, see, here again, I mean, if you, they said they looked at about 150 different things we consume, items having to do with the household, and then which ones across here are most impactful negatively with respect to the environment, and you only have a few of them here of the 150 that are clearly the most troublesome. But the relevance of that with respect to framing is we need to be clear, well, I said attending to the motivational, but concrete and focused rather than broad. And then when we're talking about sustainable consumption, which of these is it? I mean, is it transportation? Is it food? Is it household operations, housing, or what? I mean, you can try to deal with the problem kind of systemically at a very broad level, but in each of these enterprises you're going to counter resistance. Which ones can you actually focus on and hopefully mobilize people, a sufficient number of people around to make a difference? And one thing, it's not just my research, there's been a lot of research done on framing that has empirical research that has shown the importance of being concrete and focused rather than broad and abstract in terms of actually moving people or producing some kind of desired outcome. And consistent with what I said in terms of resonant sustainability frames, to focus where people are and who they are, which means linking identity to sustainability through frame and identity amplification, extension, and transformation. And the whole thing, which you know anyway, that these efforts are always embedded in a great deal of debate, contestation, and some real intense conflict. But so there's two parts to it. It's not only mobilizing those to take action or engage in certain kind of action that facilitate sustainability of some kind or another, but also how do you neutralize the counter-framers of the world, like my Congressman Dana Rohrabacher. Anyway, let me stop there. I think that probably sufficient time.
Yes. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.